And then we have the coma gene, which isn't a thing in the movie at all. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know, my name is Faith and thank you so much for watching. Today we are adding another episode to my series where I compare books to their film or TV show adaptation, and we are doing Project Hail Mary. This book was absolutely incredible, so to no surprise, it's a 5-star read for me. I also saw the movie yesterday and again, it was absolutely incredible, easy 10 out of 10. Also, shout out to my movie theater for giving away free posters for the film. As always, this video will contain spoilers, so if you haven't at least read the book or watched the movie, I wouldn't watch this video because it will spoil a lot. The movie is almost 160 minutes long and the book is almost 500 pages long, so obviously I will not be able to cover every single difference, but I have picked out 10 big ones that I noticed that I will be covering in this video. And without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is the pacing, specifically at the very beginning. The movie did move a lot faster at the beginning than the book did. In the book, he doesn't realize that he's not on Earth until about page 20, but he realizes that he is not on Earth maybe 60 seconds into the movie. In the book, he also doesn't realize that he's not in our solar system until about page 50. However, that happens maybe 3 minutes into the movie. In the book, there's also at least one flashback before he realizes that he's not by the sun. So clearly, the very beginning of the movie moved a lot faster than the very beginning of the book. I do think both the book and the movie did a really good job at showing us just how confused he was and how he didn't know who he was, where he was, or why he was there. And honestly, I think the movie did a really good job at condensing 50 pages of a book down into only a couple minutes of screen time. Next, we're going to talk about the dual timeline. In the series, I've covered a couple other books that also had a dual timeline, and I think it's interesting that all three of them, including Project Hail Mary, approached it very differently. I talked about Little Women, whose book is in chronological order, but the film, Greta Gerwig's version, is back and forth between past and future. And then I covered It, where the book goes back and forth between kids and adults. And then for the It films that came out in 2010, the first movie covered them as kids, and the second movie covered them as adults. And then of course we have Project Hail Mary, where the book has a dual timeline of his present time in space and his past memories on Earth. And the movie actually chose to stick with that by showing us his present time in space and then flashing back to his memories on Earth. In the book, it was a lot more back and forth than it was in the film. In the book, pretty much every single chapter has at least one flashback of his past on Earth. Because there's a lot more back and forth in the book, it does seem like we get a shorter time in the present and the past at one singular time, if that makes sense. Now, I wasn't timing it, so obviously I could be wrong, but in the movie, there were times where it felt like we spent, 20, 30 minutes in space, and then we flashed back to 5 minutes on Earth, and then we were back in space for a little bit. But in the book, it seemed to just jump through quicker, so it'd feel like 10 pages in space, 10 pages on Earth, 10 pages in space, 10 pages on Earth. Not that every single memory was even, it just seemed like they were more frequently switching. Because of how back and forth the book was compared to the movie, there were definitely a lot more Earth scenes in the book, and I will touch on a couple of those bigger Earth scenes that were cut out later in this video. One thing about the dual timeline that I feel was done better in the book was the fact that we were getting those memories as they were coming to him. And what I mean by that is that in the movie, it felt like some of those memories were there to just give the audience backstory. However, in the book, I think it is very clear that those memories are for Grace to learn his backstory, if that makes any sense. They definitely do it a couple times in the movie, but in the book, with every single memory, he will be doing something that will just trigger the memory, and then that memory will play into what was happening next. That being said, I think both the book and the movie handled it very well. I'm not the biggest fan of flashbacks or dual timeline because I think it is very easy to throw off the pacing. However, I think both the book and the movie did a very good job, and the pacing flowed very well. One of the bigger complaints I've seen about the movie so far is that they cut out a lot of the science. Obviously, this is a sci-fi. He's literally a scientist in space. Of course, there is still science in the movie. However, in the book, anytime there would be a problem, we would see pretty much his entire scientific process of solving that problem, and that happened dozens of times. I have seen very mixed opinions about them cutting out that much science stuff, but personally, I do kind of like the decision to take that out of the movie. I think that having that amount of science in the book worked very well. In a book, you cannot visually be told anything. Everything that you are told has to be written out for you. So it makes perfect sense that we had to walk through his scientific processes and all that. However, the vast majority of people don't want to watch a movie about a guy solving math and science problems for 2.5 hours. In the film, we still see him being presented with all of these problems. We just see his problem-solving process differently because film and literature are two different forms of art. And I really think that that's what it comes down to when we're talking about why so much of the actual scientific parts were cut out. But now, moving on to actual plot points, we're going to talk about Rocky. Rocky reveals to Grace that his entire crew, I believe it was 23 Iridians, are all dead. Grace's crew was also dead, and we know that Grace was kind of drifting out in space alone for a while. So in the film, we know that Grace was alone for a while, but we never really learned how long Rocky was alone. In the book, we are told how long Rocky was alone for, and it was 46 years, which is so sad, and I really wish that that part was included in the movie. In the movie, we get the scene of Rocky telling Grace that he's been with his mate for 186 years and it's still not enough time. Rocky the rock that you are. I really think that the movie adding in the fact that he had been drifting out there alone for 46 years really could have just elevated that scene. Regardless, it was still a very, very, very touching moment. However, I do just kind of wish that was in there. Also, the fact that when Grace was born, Rocky was literally already just floating out in deep space by himself. Devastating. In the movie, there is a scene where Strat sings karaoke of Sign of the Times by Harry Styles, and that scene was not in the book at all. I've seen somewhat mixed opinions about this scene because I've seen people complain that this was added while other things that actually happened in the book were taken out. And I get where people are coming from because honestly, yeah, I probably would have preferred actual book scenes over that. However, it's a very emotional scene in the movie and I did like the scene in the movie, so I'm kind of glad that it was there. I also feel like the scene really humanized Strat, and that's another thing I've seen really mixed opinions on. I've seen people say that she was a lot more human in the book than she was in the movie. I personally don't agree with that. I think she was a lot more humanized in the movie. And I think the karaoke scene is part of the reason I think that. So I personally did like the scene, but I do completely understand where people come from when they say they wish it wasn't included. The karaoke scene is also one of the only scenes that we get in the movie to show how close the crew was. In the book, we do get more scenes to show just how close the crew was. For example, there's one scene in the book where two of the astronauts are openly talking about how they have sex and they're gonna go have sex right after this, right in front of Grace. And honestly, it is really funny, and I do wish that that scene was included in the movie. However, with the story that the movie chose to tell, I do feel that that kind of would have been unnecessary, so I am glad that they chose to show the closeness of the crew during the karaoke scene. And then we have probably the biggest backlash that I've seen for the film, which is the fact that the Antarctica and the Sahara Desert scenes are not included in the movie. In the book, they nuke Antarctica. They did this because they were hoping that the methane gas that's like trapped under Antarctica would go up into the atmosphere and kind of blanket Earth to buy Earth a little bit more time. And the Sahara Desert is pretty much completely covered in these solar panel things to use as a astrophage breeding farm. These scenes in the book showed just how desperate Earth was, and that is one thing that I do think the movie kind of lacked a little bit. In the movie, obviously, we know that the sun is dying. However, I do feel like the stakes seemed a lot higher in the book because they kind of explained what the outcome of that would be a lot better in the book than the movie. Nuking an entire continent and then covering the third largest desert in the world in solar panels, to me, shows that they were insanely desperate. And I really think those scenes in the book show that, hey, if they're doing this, the outcome of the astrophage destroying the sun is going to be very, very bad. Obviously, the sun dimming is bad, and both the book and the movie do mention that. However, the book saying it's bad and listing all the reasons why it's bad and what's going to happen does make it seem a lot worse and does make the stakes seem a lot higher. Even though the movie didn't show these scenes, I do wish that it would have at least talked about them to show just how desperate Earth was. In the movie, when Grace passes out and Rocky gets out of his glass pod, he kind of like helps Grace to the med bed, and then Grace wakes up to see that Rocky has returned to his glass home, if you will. Rocky moves, so clearly Grace knows that he is alive, but pretty much the only thing that Grace does to try and help Rocky is put a heat lamp facing him. However, in the book, Grace helps a little too much and actually almost kills Rocky. In the book, Rocky has this soot-like substance on him, and Grace thinks that it is actually hurting Rocky and preventing Rocky from healing himself, so Grace keeps trying to brush it off of him. Fortunately, Rocky wakes up. However, when he does, he's like, dude, that soot helps me heal, and you brushing it off almost killed me. Of course, both scenes had the same outcome. Rocky, thankfully, survived. But I do like how in the book it did seem like Grace was doing a bit more to try and help Rocky, even though he was literally doing the opposite of helping. But you know what? That scene in both the book and the movie made me cry, so I think they did a good job. And then we have the coma gene, which isn't a thing in the movie at all. In the book, there is this gene, and if you have this gene, you are able to survive a long-term coma. The astronauts on this mission need to have this gene because they will be in a long-term coma and they need to be able to survive it. Only about 1 in every 7,000 people have this gene, and surprise, surprise, Grace is one of them. So in the book, the reason that Grace is chosen to go to space is because after the other crew members die, they do not have to find someone who is both more qualified than Grace and someone who has the coma gene. In the movie, he's chosen because he has been to every single meeting about astrophage, and again, the time constraints, they don't really have time to find someone else and then teach them everything that Grace already knows. In both the book and the movie, Strat does give him a choice of whether he wants to go or not, and in both, when he chooses no, she has a backup plan to get him there. In the book, Strat has him locked in a cell so that 1, he doesn't escape, and 2, so that he doesn't tell anybody that he is going against his will. So the plan was to drug him with this amnesia drug so that he wouldn't remember being forced onto the ship, and the other 2 crew members wouldn't be able to oppose him getting on the spaceship in the first place. At least that was my understanding of part of the reason. Strat figured that the amnesia could be passed off as a side effect of being in a long-term coma. And she also says that by the time he actually remembers everything, he will already be too dedicated to saving Earth, so he will save Earth. And Grace actually is like, no, I won't. I'm gonna remember and I'm not gonna help. You're all gonna die if you put me in that spaceship, because obviously he doesn't want to get on that spaceship, so he's gonna say he's not gonna help if he gets on the spaceship. And Strat is basically like, no, you won't do that. You will help. And as we know, he does help. Pretty similar to the book and the movie, of course, he says no, and you know, all the guards chase him and he does get drugged still. However, that conversation of her saying, once you remember, you'll still save Earth, and him saying, no, I won't, doesn't happen in the movie. And honestly, I really wish that it did. I just feel like character-wise, for both Strat and Grace, that is a very important part of the story. And that conversation not being included in the movie is kind of another reason why I say I think that Strat was a lot more humanized in the movie compared to the book. Obviously, in both the book and the movie, her number 1 goal is to save Earth, and when faced with the trolley problem, she chooses to kill 1 instead of 8 billion. But I just feel like in the book, especially with that conversation, she is a lot more stony, if that makes sense. I'm kind of indifferent about the coma gene being included. However, again, I just really wish that that conversation made it into the movie. Another thing that the movie left out was Grace's dilemma when he had to decide whether to continue his return to Earth or go back and save Rocky. In the movie, when Grace realizes that the Tamiba is going to basically eat all of Rocky's fuel, he doesn't really hesitate to turn around and go save Rocky. However, in the book, there is definitely some hesitation because turning around means that he will not be able to return to Earth. He only has enough food to return him to Earth or to get Rocky and go to Arid. He does not have enough to do both. So in the book, he definitely faces this dilemma of, oh, I want to return to Earth, but Rocky and all of his people are gonna die, but I don't want to die, so what do I do? Of course, he makes the decision to go and save Rocky and all of the Iridians. However, there was just that hesitation in the book where there was none in the movie. Now, if you only watch the movie, you might be confused about, oh, well, if he didn't have enough food, how is he surviving on Iridian? That is a problem that they solve in the book. In the book, the Iridians are essentially able to clone Grace's muscle, and so Grace eats this clone of his muscle, and so he's essentially eating himself in a way, and he calls them me burgers. So he survived on Iridian by eating me burgers. And the last difference we're going to touch on is Grace saving Earth. In both the book and the movie, he saved Earth. At the end of the movie, we see that Strat is watching Grace's video diary. So we can obviously assume that she received the beetles and that they will be able to save the sun, therefore saving Earth. However, the book is entirely from Grace's point of view, so we don't get that scene in the book. In the book, Rocky is telling Grace that the Iridians have been tracking the brightness level of the sun and it is no longer getting dim and it is getting brighter, so obviously we know that the beetles made it to Earth and they were able to save the sun. In the book, Earth being saved is what prompts Rocky to tell Grace that he can go home now. But in the movie, Rocky is prompted by the Iridians finally fixing Grace's ship. But in both the book and the movie, he declines and says that he will be sticking around a little bit longer, and then they both end with him teaching the little Iridians and him asking what is the speed of light. And that is Project Hail Mary. I loved both the book and the movie, and yes, the movie did change or cut out some things from the book, but I do still think that it is one of the better adaptations that I have seen. Like I said at the beginning of this video, obviously I wasn't able to cover everything, but I do think that I covered the bigger differences. Again, this is a series, so if you're curious about any other book to film or TV show adaptations and their differences, feel free to go check that out on my channel. That is all that I have for you guys today. Be sure to like and subscribe and follow my Instagram and my TikTok, which are linked in the description below for more bookish content. I really hope that you all liked the book and the movie as much as I did. Love you guys. Bye!